This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare offers thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, graphic design, photography, videography, and many more made for lifelong learners. The latest class that caught my interest on Skillshare was Procreate Animation for Illustrators, Create Easy GIFs in Procreate 5. In this class by Brooke Blazer, we are introduced to simple animations for simple and fun illustrations. This class was not only informative and full of technical insights on how to use new tools, but she also made it fun and colorful to look at. I was engaged to learn the whole way through as she used her fun illustrations as examples to create simple animated movements while sharing the tips and tricks along the way. If you're not an illustrator and you just want to play around with the animation side of things to get acquainted with the new tools, Brooke also generously uploaded her artworks that she used as examples in this class, including the layers which students can customize and download from the projects and resources section, which you can use for your class project. So even if you don't have time to create your own illustration to animate, you can still use these examples to jump straight into animation. The first 1,000 people to click the link in my description box will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare Premium so you can start exploring your creativity today. Explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity with Skillshare. Thank you again, Skillshare, for sponsoring this video. Hi everyone, this is Nya and today I'm going to be painting mushrooms. It has been a thing. I just have to make something to do with mushrooms every year, and I'm super excited to share this one with you guys today. Today I've chosen to paint Porcini mushrooms. I just love the rustic brown color of the porcini mushroom, and I also think that their round shape is very cute. So I started out by sketching out the basic shape, and I decided to paint two because I do have a limited space. I tried to vary the size, height, and shape slightly so the composition stays natural. The focal point of this painting is, of course, the mushrooms here because that is the main subject, but I am also going to draw out the leaves and also a couple of ferns behind the mushrooms just so I know how to map them out on the page and position them so I like how it's being framed. I'm not going to go too overboard with too many details as I'm sketching, but I'm simply using this as a visual cue to help me with the crucial areas which would help balance out the composition. I'm only drawing out the leaves and the ferns which are going to be in contact with the mushrooms, and I'm just going to freehand the rest as I paint later. This is because I'm comfortable with painting those elements freehand, and I don't think it's worth having all the inaccurate pencil marks if I were to draw them and erase a lot of them. But for those of you who want to try to paint the exact composition, I'll also try to have this outline available in my coffee shop as well. I think this is all the outline I need, and let me go over the colors that I'll be using. Firstly, this is Lemon Yellow by Winsor & Newton, Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Rose Madder by Holbein, Gold Brown by Schmincke, Indigo by Schmincke, and Olive Green by Holbein. So let's begin to paint. Here are the 4 colors which I'm going to switch and alternate to color the fern and the leaves in front of the mushrooms. Like usual, I have my main green, which is olive green, then the lemon yellow here to warm up and lighten the green, and then indigo to deepen the green and also to make it a cooler temperature. I also have gold brown at the bottom, but that's for a touch of accent for some leaves which might have dried up a bit, and I like to use that brown to complement the greens. I'm going to use the light green and the dark green the most, so I have it separate on my palette for easy access, and I started with the light green mixture to paint the fern first. When I painted the base of the fern, I didn't like the specific detail on the leaves, so I ended up erasing the details and I paint over it. And this is what I meant before by only having the outline to serve as rough positions, but if I don't end up liking specific details that I've drawn out, I'm just going to erase and repaint the details freehand, which is what I'll do for the second one as well. After painting the base color, I chased it down with a dark green mix with the added indigo, and I'm painting this when the base color is already a bit dry so the paint won't spread too fast, and I just placed it in random areas to make them look like it's a bit folded, and also the darkest color in the middle so there's a slight split in the middle of the fern. I'm going to treat the second one similarly as what I've painted earlier. I started out with the light green again, and as you've noticed, I also ended up erasing most of the outline. But for this one, when my brush load runs out of paint, I tried to connect it with a slightly darker green and then switching it out again into the lighter green. And this is just very subtle changes so the base color doesn't look too flat. And because I'm continuing to paint while the paint is still fairly wet, it's just going to blend nicely with each other. For the area of the fern, which will overlap the first smaller fern, I tried to use a different tone of green so they don't blend with each other into one silhouette, and at the same time, I tried to also leave out a tiny bit of paper space, especially if the paint is still slightly damp on the first fern so the shapes won't join together. I also painted over that area specifically using the darker green to separate the shapes further, and of course use that dark green as well to create that slight folds like what I did with the first fern, and add details such as the veins and midribs as well. Next, I'm going to be painting the other leaves. You'll also see me painting some leaves freehand on the side here, but for the outline, which I'll have in my coffee shop, I'll of course create the outline in full so you can just paint it in if you would like. I'm using more or less the same method as how I've painted the ferns, but instead of the light green, I've decided to use the dark green for these leaves as the dominant color instead of that light green for the fern. This is to differentiate the types of leaves so they don't all look like they're the same color, even though we are using the same color palette. Again, I like to alternate the colors as I go from dark green to light green, and for these ones, I also like to start adding the gold brown, especially for the stem. You can add the gold brown to your light green mix or your dark green mix, and also play around with the ratio of brown to green so you can create different tones. I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the rest of the leaves, and after that, I'm going to show you how I'll paint the red berries. Okay, so now I'm ready to paint the berries. I used a medium to thick consistency of quin red, and these are super simple. I'm just going to paint small circles as the outline of the berries and then leave out a small white space for the highlights, and that's pretty much it for now. I'll try to bunch them into threes or as a couple of berries or even single ones. You can do more, but since my paper is quite small, I don't want to overcrowd them, and I like to also vary the size. For the berries, which are positioned overlapping each other, I would treat it the same way as how I painted the ferns, by leaving out a bit of white from the paper so the paint doesn't travel together, creating a flat silhouette. Now I'm going to paint the vegetation around the small mushroom. For this one, I'm just going to freehand some moss texture by using the tip of my brush and flicking it outwards in different directions. Meanwhile, I'm also going to alternate the colors just like the rest of the leaves that I've painted so far. I'm only going to paint right around the mushroom because what we're doing here is basically creating a barrier or an area to avoid painting on when we are ready to paint the mushrooms. Whereas if we were to paint the mushrooms first, then we would have to paint the leaves on top of the mushroom, and depending on how opaque or transparent your paint is, the color and texture of the mushroom might distract the color of the leaves. This is why I've chosen to paint the surrounding leaves before the main subject. For the mushrooms, I started out with a mix of titanium gold ochre with the lemon yellow to paint the base color. I started with a thick consistency around the bottom left, and as I get towards the top, I'm going to just add water so the section on the top right is slightly lighter. While the base color is still a bit damp, I'm just going to continue with my gold brown, and I'm going to paint right on top while directing the paint to move along according to the cross contour of the mushrooms, and this will give the mushroom a bit more of a three-dimensional form. Because we don't have any more dark brown, I'm going to mix my own by using the gold brown as the base color, then indigo and rose madder to darken it further. I'm going to paint using the same way on a damp surface and just following the cross contour of the mushroom cap, and I'm still trying to leave the top right corner of the cap a little bit lighter than the rest. Be careful when painting the area where the fern is covering the mushroom, and if your paint isn't spreading or smoothing out as much as you would like, I would just soften it using a clean damp brush. I'm going to treat the smaller mushroom cap the same way by using the same base color of titanium gold mixed with lemon yellow. And as for the brown, I want this one to be slightly lighter, so I'm only going to use a thick consistency of gold brown to darken it instead of mixing my own dark brown. Moving on to the stem of the mushroom, I'm just going to paint using buff titanium by itself in a medium to thin consistency because I want this section to be fairly light. Then I'm going to create a darker mixture by adding a touch of indigo and gold brown with the buff titanium to create a nice warm gray color, and I'm going to use this to paint lines or the textures on the stem by painting the lines very lightly because it's always easier to build than take away with watercolors. So if it's too light, I'll just add more lines to darken some areas on the left and also under the cap. If you want the color to be more warm, you can switch out the buff titanium in the mix with titanium gold ochre like what I'm doing here. I personally like to change up the hue slightly, just like the leaves, for a variation of color which would bring out more interest to the painting. In fact, you can also use different mixtures as long as they're fairly neutral in tone and also quite light for the stem, so feel free to experiment with your color mixtures. Like usual, especially when painting with wet on wet, the colors will fade along the way as it dries, so here I wetted the area again and layered on more color to the cap. You can keep going back and forth to build up the saturation until you find a good balance all throughout the painting. I also decided to add the dark brown mixture here, but added more rose madder instead of indigo, so the dark brown has a warmer tone. I'm going to paint the stem on the smaller mushroom now as I did before. I started with buff titanium and I added the gray tones as before on the left side and also below the cap. I'm just going to leave it there and wait for it to dry for now because the surface is fairly wet, and meanwhile I'm just going to add bits of dry moss textures on the left side of the small mushroom, and when the surface is not as wet anymore, I'm going to go back to paint the lines. You might see some variation in color as I'm building up the texture on the mushroom, but as I mentioned before, it doesn't matter too much. The color ratio just depends on the temperature that you're going for, and I tend to like to play with both. So if I want a cooler temperature, I would add a bit more indigo in the mix, and if I want a warmer tone, I can either use the gold brown or even add reds like rose madder if it's already on my palette and it's easily available for me to create a very thin consistency color. I'm just going to leave the mushrooms for now and just let the paint settle and dry. Meanwhile, I'm going to add more around the mushrooms. For a bit of variation, I added a couple of dried leaves using the same color mixture as the leaves, but with added olive green and a touch of gold brown and yellow, so it's a bit more like a muted yellow-green, and I added details using gold brown to paint the veins and the midrib of those leaves. At this point, I also started to fill in some of the gaps in between the leaves, just using those natural green mixtures, but in a thicker consistency so the main elements pop out a little bit more. I felt like the right hand side of the mushroom was a bit too empty in the composition, so I decided to add more berries. For the berries, sometimes I like to also vary the color by adding lemon yellow to the quin red, and then I used dark brown to paint a branch to attach to the berries, and then use olive green with gold brown for the leaves that I'm just going to add sparingly so the branch will still show through. While I wait for that section to dry, I'm going to move on to a different area. I'm going to add darker green with muted greens to glaze over parts of the leaves that I painted earlier to give the fold effect, and sometimes just to add a bit of detail and texture to the leaves. Even though I'm glazing, I like to still alternate the colors, so I'm still creating different tones of greens on top of the different tones of greens that I used as the base color. Again, I always like to go back to the previous steps also to just build on the depth and also the saturation of the color. So there you'll see me adding the darker colors to build the depth behind certain areas of the leaves. And I'm also going to add rose madder under the berries to make them pop out a little bit more. To finish off the composition, I'm also going to add extra bits and bobs of things like branches and dry grass with my liner brush, and also add more berries just for that pop of color, and I'm just going to spread them around in places where I feel would help balance out the composition more. After adding those additional elements, the rest of the berries pop out more than the mushrooms, so I'm going to work on the form of the mushrooms and also balance out the value further by adding darker tones behind the leaves underneath the mushrooms. Lastly, I'm going to add texture to the mushroom caps. I used a dark brown mixture from indigo, rose madder, and gold brown to paint on the lower section of the caps, creating creases and lines, and then softening them with a clean damp brush so the edges of those added texture doesn't look too sharp and out of place. I made sure to add more of the darker brown mixture behind the fern to make sure that I have a good contrast and value, because right now the fern is blending too much with the mushroom. So as you can see here, as I'm adding the darker color, the fern will pop out a little bit more so it looks like it's in front of the mushroom. So that is it. At this point, I'm just going to add additional final adjustments to balance everything out. And that's pretty much it for the mushroom painting. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my links to my social media will be in my description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!